All right, hello and welcome to Decades of History, where we're going to track the safecrackers, bank robbers, and then gangsters through the Roaring Twenties into the Great Depression era, the gangster era, and then right up to about just about 1942 and U.S. involvement in World War II. All right, so we will stay in the northern part of the Midwest for now and go to Des Moines, Iowa, where we meet up with just a good, wholesome Midwestern gal who decided to provide bank bandits with a lecture on morals. Her name was Catherine Anderson, and she got quite some notoriety around the country as this story appeared in various newspapers around the country because of its novelty. She kind of is just a wholesome person with a good heart. I think the bank robbers would refer to, in modern parlance, as a Karen, but I think most of us would see her as a Good Samaritan. All right, so four robbers, again a quartet, entered the Continental Savings Bank. This is January 14th, the day after the last one, and they ended up scoring $8,800, and plus the lecture. So, that was my cat sneezing. Who's in tight? Catherine Anderson and the other employees were herded into a back room, and she took the opportunity to tell them, "You aren't going to get anywhere by holding up this bank," she went on, in defense of the bank, which I think is something that you would see back then and probably see less of today. But she went on to say, "This is a small bank getting well underway. It's a nice bank, and it won't do you any good to hold it up. Bank robbing never did anybody any good." And the bank robbers, $8,800 richer, at least for the immediate present, they laughed. They didn't argue. To their credit, they laughed and they took the loot. Or January 14th or 15th, the specifics of this story seem less important to the author of the newspaper article who wrote this back in 1926. I think the details were less important than this guy making some funny quips. It's pretty funny. Our bank robber is Michael Broshear. He was a coal miner in '58. So this sounds like what I referenced before, more of almost a spontaneous kind of thing. A coal miner who's 58 years old and he decides to rob a bank. He moseys on into this bank in Francisco, Indiana, upper Midwest again, and walks away with what was called a Hoosier bankroll. Sounds really good, but it's a large bankroll of single dollars. Walks out, a posse gets immediately on his trail. They shoot him with buckshot. They drag him back in moments after his egress from the bank. According to our jolly journalist, quote, "Score one for the vigilante and dead or alive reward system, which Indiana bankers have established in recent months," end quote. The writer also referenced the current criminology, the study of crime, and the current discourse on how to prevent it. Apparently, experts of the day were blaming defective glands within the criminal's body, including the pituitary, the pineal, the suprarenal, and more. So basically, they thought that criminals could be cured through psychology or surgery. And just for fun, the writer wasn't sure, so he said maybe. And he spelt it M-E-B-B-E, which I had never seen before. I thought that was kind of cool. So could they be cured through psychology or surgery? Maybe. Anyway, he did acknowledge that the experts might be correct, but the recent antidote of, quote, buckshot inserted in the rear elevation of a bank bandit, end quote, might steer him in a better direction than some gland. Later in court, our bank robber Broshear was sentenced a really broad range of 10 to 21 years. The judge said to Broshear, our 58-year-old coal miner, quote, "It wasn't a very profitable robbery, was it?" end quote. To which Broshear, who ended up having $60 in that Hoosier bankroll for a very fleeting period of time between getting the cash and getting shot, simply replied, quote, I'll say it wasn't, end quote. Kind of the day of the polite bank robber, I guess. Earlier on, we saw two honest youths discover $1,000 worth of stolen loot. Now we turn to a couple of other youths, slightly older, well, considerably older, but still considered youths, I guess, who were already on a pretty bad path. We have Jewel Brewer, who was 19, and Dan Shirley, who was 23, so very young men. And they were arrested for their involvement in the robbing of a Bank of Odin, Arkansas, bank on January 16th of 1926. So we're back to Arkansas, still in the Midwest. Apparently the cashier, named H.J. Plemons, P-L-E-M-M-O-N-S, was wounded, though not seriously. We don't know any further details on that. But during the heist he was wounded, and the youth ended up stealing between $700 and $800 worth of, well, loot. Now, I did check the area to see about this Plemons. I wanted to see what his injury was, how he fared, etc. Couldn't find an H.J. Plemons. I did find an A.J. Plemons, who was registered in the area's Methodist Church for 1925. Probably the same guy. He was registered as a clerk. So clerk, cashier, kind of sounds like him. No other details on the disposition of his wounds, etc. But the robbers were captured. So Jewel and Dan were captured. They didn't have cash because it sounds like they had taken that money and blown it pretty quickly. But when their car was recovered, they found a sack of silver dollars inside the car, and it was determined that it was probably too heavy for these guys to tote around, which is hard to believe because these are a couple of Arkansas farm boys, as they were described in the article, so they surely wouldn't have lacked muscle, but I guess maybe it would have been awkward to carry a big sack of silver coins clanking around as opposed to paper dollars. And so that's what they did. Appears that they blew the money, and we don't know the disposition yet of Jewel Brewer and Dan Shirley. Again, still sticking within the Midwest, but heading north to Wisconsin we go. And this is kind of not a bank robbery that's taken place just in January of 26. Instead, these are robbers who got caught kind of after the fact in January of 26. It's an interesting story, though. This is January 18th, 1926, and banknotes that had been stolen but whose serial numbers had been documented and recorded were put into circulation by one of a quartet of crooks. In the end of this little snippet here, we have 3 of the 4 being arrested because someone finally decided, okay, I'm going to spend this money. So back in September of 1925, the robbers had actually stolen $14,000 worth of stamps from a post office. They took that and they converted it to cash by selling it to people at a discount. James C. Marsh was apparently or allegedly an escaped convict. Tony Mason and a guy named Shorty Casey confessed to their roles in that post office robbery that took place in September 25. Now Marsh, there's confusion over this, but we're going with this for now. Marsh, James C. Marsh, had this alias of Oklahoma Blackie, B-L-A-C-K-I-E, Oklahoma Blackie, and he was being held at La Crosse, Wisconsin. I think there's confusion though on the author's behalf. This is the 1926 author of the newspaper article. At the time, there was a notorious outlaw who was wanted for murder, including the murder of a police officer, for bank robbery, and all sorts of different kind of theft. This was a guy who was pretty bad. But that man had been arrested in 1924 for an Oklahoma bank robbery and was supposedly serving a term, and it was in prison until 1933 when he escaped the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Possible that Marsh also had the nickname Oklahoma Blackie, while this notorious outlaw wanted for murder, bank robbery, and all-around theft named Blackie Thompson who was probably born in Oklahoma as Irvin Thompson, and was certainly active in Oklahoma, was just Blackie Thompson from Oklahoma, not Oklahoma Blackie. Confused yet? I am. Anyway, we had this James C. Marsh, possibly called Oklahoma Blackie, being arrested and held in Wisconsin. Why? What was the money used for? Purchase furniture. Marsh, James C. Marsh, Oklahoma Blackie, had been serving a sentence in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, but escaped after 2 years of his bid for an earlier bank robbery. That part is reminiscent of and frighteningly similar to Blackie Thompson, making me wonder, maybe this is the same person. Maybe James C. Marsh is Irvin Thompson, is Oklahoma Blackie, is Blackie Thompson. For now, that's my cat screaming. For now, we'll just leave that with a question mark. Interesting, though. Anyway, Tony Mason, one of the other guys, was arrested in Chicago and held for North Dakota authorities on a different robbery charge. And our Shorty Casey was held at Elkhart, Indiana, all upper Midwest. The fourth mystery robber was still at large at the time. We will look for more information in the coming months, especially on this information on Marsh, to see if we can really nail down his identity. Is this two people or is this the same guy? So here we have another quartet for this bank heist. These four guys headed out to California to strike it rich. So they immediately turned to bank robbery, and with really bad consequences, as you'll see. They decided to rob the Railroad National Bank in Roseville, California. That was their target. They entered it on the afternoon of January 18th, which is the third robbery on the 18th, by the way, which is interesting. They arrived in a stolen car. Is that a shock? No. And what they did was an old-fashioned stick-em-up robbery. Hands in the air, give us the loot. And they ended up fleeing with over $45,000. On their collective heels were Sacramento police detectives driving in an armored car. And 2 hours later, they had been captured and the money returned to the bank. Each detective was rewarded with $100 for doing their job, and doing it very well. So who were the robbers? Well, the newspaper delivered the news in a fun, almost condescending way. First up was, quote, Whitey, who the author said was from, quote, nobody knows where, end quote. Next guy was John Ryan, a 50-year-old who'd been convicted 4 times previously for bank robbery and was a, quote, recent graduate of the Missouri Penitentiary. How does a person get convicted of robbing a bank 4 times? They serving short terms and going back to it, they escaping all these times? There seems to be an issue either with sentencing or security, because this guy is on his 5th bank robbery. Next guy is Joe Rechison, R-E-C-H-I-S-O-N, 38-year-old from Montreal. And Tom Newman, 33, of Reading, Pennsylvania. I looked through a mug book of Sacramento for the years 1925 to 1927, and I also did a quick genealogy search for Newman and came up empty. Newman's name doesn't appear in the mug book either, which makes me wonder if he didn't die shortly after the shootout. What shootout? Well, Whitey, whose actual name was not known. The police didn't know his name. His fellow bandits didn't know his name. He was shot dead on the spot. Ryan and Newman were also wounded badly and were recovering in a hospital. That's why I think that Newman died, because we don't see a mugshot of him, but we do of John Ryan. And I'm not sure what it is about January 18th, but it was a Monday, and I wonder if they didn't have the weekend to sit and think about it. So I'm also going to be tracking days of the week to see if there's not a trend. In fact, I'm going to be tracking all this data. I do want to track days of the week. I think that might be interesting. Does this always happen on Mondays because people have been fuming over the weekend? Fridays because they're getting ready for the weekend? Is there a particular day of the week that seemed better than others? for robberies. I do want to look at states and regions. I mean, right now we're mostly in the middle of the country, although we just visited California for one. All the pertinent information, date, day of the week, location, by state and by region, the amount of money that is taken, participants in robbers, participants as other security, detectives, police, cashiers, tellers, innocent bystanders, etc., any casualties. And then as time goes by, we'll add on to it with sentencing and time actually served. So that's the plan with that tracker. I'll be adding that in the information below, somewhere in the video description, where some of the other information that we'll be looking for, which is a little bit less obvious than the who, what, when, where, and why, the facts kind of thing, does seasonality have anything to do with an increase or decrease in robberies? Is there a presence of World War I veterans? And also, even if there's a kind of a family heritage of criminality, do we see a trend in that regard as well? All that information will be tracked on the tracker. Thus far, it's been groups of men perpetrating the crimes. We did see the one lecture by the Midwestern gal, Catherine Anderson. Now, in support, I guess, of equal opportunity, we're going to look at a actual mother-daughter robbery combine. Combine being a term like crew or gang, combine. This robbery is, because it's a mother-daughter, because it's women doing this, it got national attention. It's published in January 26. I believe it may have taken place at the end of 1925. In fact, there's a New York Times article that, if correct, states that it occurred in November of 1925, and that kind of sounds about right. And with that, we travel to South Dakota, where we meet Catherine Rogers, who is a 40-year-old mother and wife. Her 18-year-old daughter, Zera, Z-E-R-A. We see them being arrested shortly after their first and hopefully only bank robbery. According to a different source, Zera is actually named Zera Crum. 18, awfully young, but back in 1926, not so. So she may very well have been married to a man named Crum. More information may come out as we see how they approach the trial in the upcoming months. What happened was the two entered the Renner State Bank and happened on the only employee, who was a cashier named H.S. Wilkinson. Mrs. Rogers pointed the pistol at him, but she later said that she would not have actually killed him. She was threatening him, but she never actually would have killed him, which was awfully nice. They actually found a literal trail of pennies leading right up to the Rogers place. And when the police got there, they found the mother still clothed in men's clothing. When confronted with the knowledge that the police had that they'd exchanged 700 pennies for bigger coinage at a Sioux Falls, South Dakota store, Mrs. Rogers confessed to the robbery. In the end, they had gotten away with, albeit temporarily, with $200. The detective asked the daughter why she'd participated, and the daughter explained that her mother asked her to. So she was very obedient in that regard. When asked why Renner State Bank, Mrs. Rogers said it was simply luck. They drove around. They were looking for the first bank they could come across where there weren't customers. So they wanted to have just an employee, and they happened to, and H.S. Wilkinson. Mrs. Rogers added that neither of the impromptu robbers was nervous beforehand, although the night before they couldn't really eat very well. They lost their appetites, and they didn't sleep very well either. And later, when the women rested in their cells, they didn't appear to be concerned nor regretful. But here's where the story takes a sad turn. Mrs. Rogers had said that they needed the money. Everyone does. And she said, but that's all, as in terms of the explanation to the police. But it turned out that her husband, Zera's father, had been disabled during World War I and, quote, according to the paper, lies helpless in bed. So descriptions of the man's disability lead me to believe it was what they called shell shock back at that time. And I know from looking into the man that he had been part of a hospital unit during World War I at the Battle of the Argonne Forest. So he'd broken. The Veterans Bureau arranged a hospital bed for Mr. Rogers. American Legion was trying to find the family more monetary relief, as Mr. Rogers was at that point only drawing $50 a month payout for having gotten injured during the war. The ladies pleaded insanity when the case went to trial, and the New York Times article wrote that welfare workers disputed Mrs. Rogers' rationale, saying that they didn't have a need. They didn't have a need for money, and that therefore Mrs. Rogers' rationale of robbing the bank for money to pay because her husband was injured during the war didn't make sense. So we'll follow up more on Catherine and Zira Rogers and what became of them when they pleaded insanity. So lastly, this is a story that's dated in January. It's published in January of 1926. It takes place in Arizona, but it reads like the author is actually participating in a Reader's Digest contest or writing competition. And it sounds like it happened before January of 26, maybe in the summer of 1925, but no information was as of yet available. So we'll see going forward how what the results are. It takes place in Arizona, and the author attributes kind of a really strong, colorful country vernacular. The story starts with, quote, "The confounded phone a-ringin'," end quote. So that gives you a flavor of how the man was writing. Maybe the confounded phone was a-ringing, who knows. But anyway, Sheriff Jim Chappell was assuming that another resident was calling in and wanted him and his team to come out and to put down a wild dog. Apparently, from the article, it was super hot and it was driving the wild dogs in the area crazy, and that the sheriff's office was being inundated with calls to come out and put down yet another crazed wild dog. As it turns out, this call instead was about 3 men robbing a bank in Gadsden, Arizona. Gadsden, if you think of the Gadsden Purchase, you picture the south part of Arizona, the south part of New Mexico, right on the Mexican border, and Gadsden is a small town in there somewhere in Arizona, clearly. Anyway, they were called about a robbery, 3 men robbing the bank in Gadsden. The sheriff, Jim Chappell, and his deputies, presumably deputies Billy and Bert, no last names, loaded up 6 guns and rifles and hightailed it lickety-split because the robbers were expected to flee into Mexico. The sheriff and the deputies arrived at the bank and learned that the teller, S.T. Cobb, had been shot and killed during the robbery, and the robbers had escaped with money, $658. So a dead teller and $658 stolen. The sheriff and deputies were informed that another sheriff and deputies from Yuma nearby had been heading their way in a gray Studebaker, but that vehicle rolled into an arroyo and then rolled off a Butte's bank and fell 180 feet. No further information on how that turned out for that sheriff and deputies. I presume it didn't turn out well, and as that information, if that information becomes available, we'll update as well. So that leaves just Sheriff Chappell, deputies Billy and Bert. So the police get on the trail of these escaped, apparently 3 robbers, who were headed toward the Colorado River, and with the land getting thicker with tangled and prickly trees. This quote-unquote clear-eyed sheriff was reputed to have great tracking skills, or reading the marks, as the author called it, in the sand, and showed that the crooks had actually taken off, removed their shoes, and jumped into the Colorado River, meaning they were making a swim for it across the river to make it to Mexico. The next day, the Sonoran Inspector of Police Francisco Peralta called Chappell to inform him that two, quote, unsavory Americans, end quote, had been captured and were going to be kicked out of Mexico. How he was going to do it was he was going to have their 6 shooters emptied of shells and the bullets put in the left-hand pockets of the smaller man, and an old sack with the money that they'd stolen in it tied to the belt of the taller man. Presumably they would have been handcuffed together, so they couldn't obviously get at the money and the bullets, and were going to be dumped across the border, handcuffed together in some form or fashion. They're described by height clearly because neither American had given their name. When the sheriff arrived, instead of finding the 2 bank robbers bound together, he found 50 residents of Yuma and Gadsden who were armed to the teeth, including a few who were carrying cow ropes, and according to the article, quote, though there wasn't a steer in sight, end quote, meaning they were preparing to lynch these 2 bank robbers. Sheriff Chappell called Peralta, but was happy to hear that Peralta said something came up. We're unable to drag this undesirable duo out of Mexico for a few days, and so as it turned out, they inadvertently thwarted the would-be lynching. Peralta and Chappell decided, let's let this fury die down and then we'll deal with it. So that's another one that we'll have to look forward into the future to find out what happened to the tall and the short unsavory Americans. And then back to the article, quote unquote, and sure as shooting, quote, soon's we get settled down for a nap and a little rest, that ornery telephone will ring and somebody'll be a-yelling, mad dog out here, sheriff, come a-running and kill him. According to the sheriff, that's the trouble of being the sheriff of a hot county. So, more to come, assuming those 2 unsavory Americans did actually get out of Mexico alive. So that was January 1926. Obviously, up next, February 1926. If you enjoyed the content, give it a thumbs up, please. Feel free to subscribe. I will attach the tracker, so if you're interested in tracking these along the way, it should fill up quite a bit. This was Decades of History. Thank you for watching.